592 Association. Yes, my operator is telling me. That is what it's called. The 592 Association. A laugh when people's characters are being destroyed. While hundreds of people, characters are being slaughtered. And they are in pain, and they are in anguish, and they are being humiliated. And they are being ridiculed, and they are being embarrassed in the eyes of their professional peers, in the eyes of their parents, in the eyes of their peers, in the eyes of their neighbors, in the eyes of their community. 592, enjoying it, thanking Melly. Well, let the 592 get you out now.
Okay, so you've given us quite a lot to dig into today, and it's all centered around a really specific situation. But it seems like it kind of opens up all these bigger questions about Guyana, so let's see what we can make of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at everything you've sent over, we've got legal stuff, political reactions, and social media all mixed up together. It's fascinating, and I think it's going to be a really interesting deep dive for us.
Totally. And having the Attorney General's own commentary on this, that gives us a really unique perspective, right? So we're going to start with this whole Melissa Atwell situation and try to make sense of the protests and what people are arguing about. Then we'll look at the free speech issue, because that seems to be a big part of this. And then we'll see how all of this connects to even bigger stuff happening in Guyana, including some of the historical context that the Attorney General brought up. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Perfect. So the Attorney General starts by talking about these protests in Guyana, right? And they're all connected to this woman, Melissa Atwell, who's apparently pretty well known for the things she posts on Facebook and YouTube.
Right. And it's important to be clear on this from the start because there's been some confusion about it. The Attorney General really emphasizes that Mrs. Atwell was arrested and is being detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. And this is all happening in Louisiana, so it's not something the Guyanese government was involved in.
Yeah, he makes that very clear, which makes sense because people are protesting in Guyana about something that happened in the U.S.
Exactly. The Attorney General's point is that her detention is due to an alleged violation of U.S. immigration laws, so it falls under the jurisdiction of the United States.
It adds a whole other layer, though, because the Attorney General also mentions that he had actually filed a libel lawsuit against Mrs. Atwell before all of this happened.
Oh, right. I saw that. That's because of the allegations she made about him leaking confidential government information. It's interesting because he even mentions that it was hard to officially serve her with the lawsuit because she was living in the U.S. at the time.
So there's already this legal history between them. But the Attorney General is very adamant that the Guyanese government had nothing to do with her getting arrested and detained by the U.S. authorities. He really wants to separate those two things.
Absolutely. But of course, the political implications are unavoidable. The Attorney General points out that opposition parties in Guyana, specifically the PNC and the AFC, have joined the protests. And his response is basically, if you have a problem with this, you should be protesting the U.S. government, not us. He even mentions President Trump and his past stance on immigration.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, direct your energy where it actually makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is where that whole free speech argument comes into play.
Exactly. The Attorney General directly addresses the argument that Mrs. Atwell's detention is a violation of her freedom of expression.
Right. And his counterargument is that she's been expressing her opinions freely for years without any interference from the Guyanese government.
Mm-hmm.
He even uses his own libel lawsuit as an example. He's saying that was a legal response to what he believed were false statements, not an attempt to silence her.
And it does raise that question, right? Where's the line between expressing your opinions and potentially breaking the law?
Totally. And he goes on to say that there were actually numerous complaints filed with U.S. law enforcement agencies regarding Mrs. Atwell, possibly about some sort of fraudulent activity, although he doesn't give any specific details about that.
That's interesting. So it might not just be about her social media posts. It seems like there might be more to the story from the U.S. perspective, but it's important to note that those are just allegations at this point.
Right. But to give us a better idea of what kind of things she was posting, the Attorney General mentions that Ms. Atwell would often tag him and agencies like the FBI and Homeland Security in her post. And he specifically talks about one post she made after the U.S. elections in 2024.
What did she say in that post?
He quotes her as saying, "Unlike Guyana, the law does work here." And she apparently made comments about then President Trump potentially facing legal trouble. So he was clearly engaged with U.S. politics and the U.S. legal system.
It's interesting how she contrasts Guyana and the U.S. in that quote.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But I think the Attorney General brings it up to emphasize his point. These protests in Guyana are essentially directed at the U.S. government for upholding its own laws within its own borders. He's saying every sovereign nation has the right to do that.
Right. But then he takes it a step further and talks about the actual content of some of Mrs. Atwell's posts. He says they go beyond political commentary and include personal attacks, vulgar language, and attempts to humiliate people. And he specifically mentions that women were targeted with some really offensive descriptions. It raises the question of whether that kind of speech is still protected.
Right. It's that whole debate about where we draw the line between free speech and harmful speech. And the Attorney General talks about the real-world impact of these posts, the distress and harm caused to the individuals involved. He even mentions a group called the 592 Association that he criticizes for seemingly enjoying and encouraging this type of behavior online. It sounds like they might have played a role in spreading some of Ms. Atwell's more inflammatory content.
Wow, so there's this whole online community aspect to this as well.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the Attorney General himself was a target of these attacks, so he has a personal stake in this. He even reiterates that he hopes Mrs. Atwell will eventually have to appear in court to address the libel case he filed against her.
So he believes in using legal avenues to address these issues rather than government censorship.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about Ms. Atwell and the whole free speech debate. Now, the Attorney General switches gears and brings up some other political happenings in Guyana.
This is where it gets even more complex because he starts talking about the ongoing legal cases related to the 2020 election and the allegations of fraud.
Yeah, and this is where it gets kind of crazy because he claims the defense in these cases is now trying to argue that the election observers were actually the ones trying to rig the election.
Wait, the election observers, like the international organizations and all that?
Exactly. The Carter Center, the OAS, the Commonwealth team, the diplomats, even the Guyana Bar Association. He's basically saying they're trying to pin it on the people who were supposed to be making sure the election was fair.
That seems like a pretty out there claim.
Yeah, and the Attorney General compares it to the people who are protesting Melissa Atwell's detention. He seems to be suggesting that in both cases, there's a kind of disconnect from reality, like they're clinging to these far-fetched ideas.
I see. So he's trying to connect those two things, the election fraud case and the Atwell situation, as examples of what he sees as flawed reasoning.
Right, and then he brings up this whole one Guyana concept that President Ali has been pushing. He said the goal is to bring everyone in Guyana together to promote unity and inclusivity.
And of course, there's criticism, right? People saying it's just a political slogan, something the PPP came up with for their own benefit.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
But the Attorney General pushes back on that. He says it's not just a PPP thing. It's a reflection of the government's commitment to national unity. He's really trying to present it as a genuine effort to bridge the divides in Guyana.
And then he gets into the historical context, right? He compares one Guyana to the PNC's party paramountcy from the 1970s under Forbes Burnham.
Yeah, and he describes it as this period where the PNC basically asserted its power over everything. The government, the parliament, even the courts. He even mentions how the PNC flag was flown higher than the Guyana flag on the Court of Appeal building, which is a pretty powerful symbol.
Wow. So he's drawing this contrast between the PNC's approach, where the party was supreme, and the current government's emphasis on national unity.
Exactly. He's using this historical example to kind of make a point about the criticisms being leveled at the one Guyana concept. It's like he's saying, look, you're complaining about this, but let's not forget what it was like before.
It's a way of reframing the conversation.
Absolutely. And then he brings up Aubrey Norton, the current leader of the PNC. He mentions that Norton actually expressed pride in the fact that essential food items were banned under the PNC government back in the day. He even reminded people that possessing these items was illegal at the time.
That's a pretty stark reminder of a very specific time in Guyana's history.
Right. And then he shifts gears again and talks about Nigel Hughes from the AFC. Apparently, Hughes has been critical of the government's handling of the situation with Venezuela.
But of course, the Attorney General doesn't just let that slide. He goes on to criticize some of the things Hughes has done and said recently.
Yeah. He brings up a situation where Hughes' wife, who's a government minister, awarded a contract to her own company. And he also mentions that Hughes continues to do legal work for ExxonMobil, which is a pretty controversial company in Guyana.
So he's basically trying to undermine Hughes' credibility.
Exactly. He's painting him as hypocritical and maybe even self-serving. And then he talks about how Hughes is representing an American company that's trying to get access to funds held in Guyana's central bank as part of some kind of legal battle with Venezuela.
And the Attorney General sees that as a threat to Guyana's sovereignty.
Yeah, he's pretty concerned about it. And he doesn't hold back when it comes to his opinion of Hughes and the AFC's understanding of the whole Venezuela issue.
Yeah.
He basically says they're unqualified to assess the situation and that the government's approach is based on expert advice and intelligence.
Wow. Strong words.
Definitely. And then he briefly touches on a legal challenge to some amendments that were made to the National Registration Act. These amendments removed the residency requirement for voting, which basically aligned the law with the Constitution.
And what was his take on that?
Well, he goes to the court proceedings and basically criticizes the arguments made by the lawyer who was challenging the amendments. He sees it as another example of the opposition trying to create obstacles.
So he's trying to present a pattern here.
Yeah, like he's saying this is how they operate. And then finally he talks about the quality of life in Guyana. And he makes a pretty bold statement. He says that in his opinion, Guyanese are currently experiencing the best quality of life in the country's history.
I bet that got some reactions.
Oh, absolutely. But he anticipates the criticism and clarifies that he's speaking generally. He encourages people to think about their own lives compared to the past, to consider things like property ownership and travel opportunities.
He's trying to paint a picture of progress.
Exactly. And he acknowledges that poverty still exists in Guyana, but he thinks it's important to recognize how far the country has come. He even suggests that some of the people who criticize Guyana from abroad might have ulterior motives, that they're using it as a way to attack the government.
So there's political dimension to even those criticisms, in his view.
Exactly. It's never just a simple conversation.
Wow. So taking a step back, it's clear that this whole Melissa Atwell situation has become this catalyst for a much larger discussion in Guyana. It's touched on freedom of speech, the power of social media, the role of the law, and the complexities of domestic and international politics.
Totally. And it's fascinating how the Attorney General connects all these different threads. He brings in the election fraud cases, the One Guyana concept, historical examples from the PNC era, even the situation with Venezuela. It's like he's trying to create this narrative about where Guyana stands today and the challenges it faces.
It definitely makes you think about the forces that shape a country's trajectory, both internally and on the global stage.
Absolutely. And this whole thing with social media, it's a reminder of how interconnected everything is now. What happens in one country can have ripple effects all over the world. And this case really highlights that intersection between free speech, the law, and the influence of online platforms.
It's a lot to unpack.
It definitely is. And I think we've just scratched the surface here. This whole situation with Melissa Atwell, it's like a window into all these bigger issues that Guyana is grappling with.
I agree. It's a reminder that even seemingly isolated events can reveal a lot about a society's values, its political climate, and the historical forces that continue to shape its present.
Totally. And with that, we'll leave it to our listeners to continue exploring these ideas and to draw their own conclusions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.